In the vast expanse of the galaxy, where civilizations rise and fall like waves upon a cosmic shore, there exists a fundamental truth that has governed interstellar politics for millennia. When the strong prey upon the weak must either adapt, submit, or perish. For countless species, this harsh reality has meant bending the knee to those with superior technology, greater numbers, or more ruthless dispositions. But sometimes, just sometimes, the universe throws a curveball that changes everything. When the distress signal pierced through the void, it carried with it the desperate pleas of an entire civilization facing extinction. The message was simple, transmitted in every known galactic language. Help us. Please. Anyone. The Zephyrian collective, once proud and peaceful, had fallen to the hegemony's war machine in less than 72 hours. Their cities burned, their people enslaved, their culture systematically erased. The galactic community did what it had always done in such situations. It looked the other way. The hegemony was too powerful, too ruthless, too deeply entrenched in the power structures of known space. No one would risk their own worlds for a species already marked for extinction. No one, that is, except for a small blue planet in a quiet corner of the galaxy, where the inhabitants had never learned the most important lesson of cosmic survival. Sometimes the smart thing to do is nothing at all. Earth was about to remind the galaxy why apex predators don't ask for permission. The quantum communicator crackled to life in the depths of the Terran Defense Coalition's listening post, nestled deep within the Cheyenne Mountain complex. Lieutenant Sarah Chun had been monitoring deep space transmissions for 3 years, and in all that time, she had never heard anything quite like the signal that now flooded her headphones. It wasn't the technical specifications that made her blood run cold, though the quantum encryption was sophisticated beyond anything in Earth's current arsenal. It wasn't even the sheer desperation in the alien voices, though that was heartbreaking enough. What made her hands tremble as she reached for the priority communication button was the realization that somewhere out there, an entire civilization was dying, and they were screaming into the void for anyone to hear. This is Zephyrian Central Command. The translated voice was clearly automated, cycling through what the computer identified as 47 different galactic languages. We are under attack by hegemony forces. Our defenses have failed. Population centers are falling, requesting immediate assistance from any civilization capable of faster-than-light travel. We can offer technological exchange, cultural artifacts, resource coordinates. Please respond. We are dying. Chen's finger hovered over the alert button. Earth's official policy on first contact was clear: observe, analyze, report through proper channels, and, under no circumstances, reveal humanity's existence to potentially hostile alien forces. The carefully crafted protocols have been developed by the brightest minds in xenopolitics, designed to protect humanity's fledgling interstellar presence from the dangers of a universe that might not welcome new players. But those protocols have been written by people who had never heard the sound of an entire species begging for help. She pressed the button. Within minutes, the transmission was racing through encrypted channels to every major military installation on Earth. The emergency session of the Terran Security Council was called for 0600 hours GMT, but the real decisions were already being made in the shadowy corridors of military intelligence and the offices of people whose names never appeared in public records. Admiral Marcus Webb had been expecting this day for over a decade. As the head of Earth's newly formed Stellar Operations Command, he had spent countless hours preparing for the moment when humanity would have to decide what kind of species they wanted to be on the galactic stage. The theoretical scenarios had been endless. First contact with peaceful explorers, aggressive expansion by hostile empires, resource competition with established powers. None of the simulations had prepared him for this. How certain are we about the translation matrix? Webb asked, his weathered face illuminated by the holographic display showing the Zephyrian home system. The tactical readout was grim. 12 planets, 5 of them inhabited, all under simultaneous assault by what appeared to be a massive fleet. Dr. Elena Vasquez, Earth's leading expert in xenolinguistics, looked up from her tablet with tired eyes. She had been working for 18 hours straight, cross-referencing the alien languages with Earth's limited database of intercepted galactic communications. 97% confidence on the core message. The Zephyrians are definitely under attack, definitely requesting assistance, and definitely being ignored by every other civilization in range. And this hegemony? Based on signal traffic analysis, they control approximately 18% of known galactic space. Their expansion patterns suggest a militaristic society with advanced technology and no apparent interest in negotiation. Every species they've encountered has either submitted or been eliminated. General Patricia Hayes, the gruff commander of Earth Space Marine Corps, leaned forward. What are we talking about in terms of numbers? The tactical display shifted, showing intercepted communications data. Best estimates suggest the hegemony force consists of approximately 400 warships, ranging from frigate class to what appear to be planet killers. The Zephyrian defense fleet was eliminated in the first 6 hours of combat. The room fell silent. Earth's entire stellar navy consisted of 12 ships, most of them still in the prototype phase. The idea of challenging a force that could field 400 warships seemed not just suicidal, but absurd. There is one factor we need to consider, Dr. Vasquez said quietly. The Zephyrians aren't just asking for help from anyone. They're specifically requesting assistance from any civilization capable of faster-than-light travel. That suggests they know about the galactic community, but they're still broadcasting in the hope that someone new might hear them. Someone desperate enough or crazy enough to respond, Webb muttered. Or someone with nothing to lose, Hayes added. President Michelle Carter's voice cut through the discussion from the secure communication link. She had been listening from the White House Situation Room, surrounded by her own team of advisors. Admiral Webb, what are your professional recommendations? Webb stared at the tactical display for a long moment, watching as another Zephyrian population center went dark. Madam President, from a purely military standpoint, any intervention would be suicide. We lack the numbers, the firepower, and the tactical experience to engage a force of this magnitude in open combat. I'm hearing a but in your voice, Admiral. But we're not talking about open combat. The hegemony appears to be focused on occupation and subjugation rather than total annihilation. They want the Zephyrian worlds intact, which means they're constrained in terms of what weapons they can use. And they're not expecting any interference. Dr. Vasquez pulled up another display. There's something else. The Zephyrians have been broadcasting technical specifications along with their distress call. Their technology is significantly more advanced than ours in some areas, particularly in defensive systems and quantum communications. If we could establish contact. You're talking about technology transfer, President Carter said. I'm talking about survival, Webb replied. Madam President, the hegemony's expansion pattern suggests they'll reach Earth's sector within 50 to 70 years. We can prepare for that confrontation now, with allies and advanced technology, or we can wait and face them alone with whatever we could develop in isolation. The silence stretched across the secured channels as the weight of the decision settled on everyone present. Earth had spent decades debating whether humanity was ready for contact with alien civilizations. Now, their first real opportunity for interstellar diplomacy was coming at the point of gun. There's one more factor, General Hayes said. The men and women who volunteered for the Space Marine Corps didn't sign up to hide behind Earth's atmospheric shield while genocide happens within communication range. We've spent years training them to defend human interests in space. Those interests include being the kind of species that answers distress calls. President Carter's voice was steady when she responded. Admiral Webb, you have authorization to establish communication with the Zephyrian government and explore options for assistance. General Hayes, begin immediate mobilization of available forces. Dr. Vasquez, I need a comprehensive analysis of hegemony capabilities and vulnerabilities within 12 hours. And if the situation deteriorates before we can mount an effective response. Webb asked. Then, we remind the galaxy what happens when apex predators decide they've had enough of bullies. As the communication ended, and the various officials began implementing humanity's first interstellar military intervention. Nobody in the room was thinking about protocols or careful diplomatic procedures. They were thinking about the sound in that alien voice, the sound of people who had run out of time and options, crying out in the darkness for someone, anyone, to prove that the universe still contained more than predators and prey. Earth was about to answer that cry, and the galaxy would never be the same. The next 8 hours were a blur of activity as Earth's military machine shifted into a gear that most of its personnel had never experienced. Space docks that had been conducting routine maintenance and training exercises suddenly found themselves preparing for humanity's first interstellar war. The 12 ships of Earth's stellar navy were primitive by galactic standards, fusion-powered, kinetic weapon-armed, and built with human engineering principles that prioritize reliability over elegance. But they were crewed by humans, and humans had spent their entire evolutionary history learning how to be more dangerous than anything else on their planet. The communication with Zephyrian Central Command was established at 1,347 hours GMT, transmitted through quantum relay stations that Earth had secretly deployed throughout their local stellar neighborhood. The voice that responded to Admiral Webb's careful greeting was one of the most beautiful sounds any human had ever heard, the sound of hope returning to someone who had given up. "This is Admiral Webb of the Terran Defense Coalition. We have received your distress signal and are prepared to render assistance." The pause that followed lasted nearly 30 seconds, long enough for Webb to wonder if the transmission had failed. Then, the voice returned, speaking in heavily accented but understandable English. "Terran, we do not have records of your species in a galactic database. Are you a recently emerged civilization?" "Very recently. But we're here, and we're coming." Another pause. "Admiral Webb, we are grateful beyond words for your response, but we must inform you that the hegemony force consists of over 400 combat vessels. We cannot ask you to sacrifice your people for ours." Webb looked at the tactical display, showing Earth's 12 ships preparing for departure. 412. Even with the element of surprise, even with humanity's talent for violence, the odds were overwhelming. "Zephyrian Command, how long can you hold out? Our last stronghold will fall within 72 hours. After that," the voice trailed off. "After that, the hegemony will begin the cultural elimination protocols." What does that mean? Systematic destruction of all Zephyrian art, literature, historical records, and the elimination of any individual capable of passing on our traditions to future generations. Webb closed his eyes for a moment, seeing in his mind the vast libraries and museums of Earth, the countless generations of human achievement that defined what they were as a species. The idea of all of that being deliberately erased was something his mind could barely process. "Understood. Transmit all available tactical data on hegemony forces and defensive positions. We'll be there in 60 hours. Admiral, may I ask how many ships you command?" Webb looked around at his bridge crew, seeing the same determination in their eyes that he felt in his own chest. "Enough." As the transmission ended, Lieutenant Chun looked up from her communication station. "Sir, we're receiving priority signals from the other 11 ships. All captains report ready for departure." "Signal the fleet," Webb said. "We jump in 30 minutes. "Sir," Chen's voice was carefully controlled. "The crews are asking about rules of engagement." Webb thought about the automated distress call, cycling endlessly through 47 languages, begging for help that wasn't coming. He thought about cultural elimination protocols and the systematic destruction of everything that made a species unique. "Tell them the rules are simple," he said. "We're going to remind the hegemony why humans are the only species on Earth that hunts for sport." The journey to Zephyrian space took 58 hours through the quantum tunnel network that connected inhabited systems across the galaxy. For most species, faster-than-light travel was a routine matter of activating pre-established jump gates and following carefully mapped routes that had been used for thousands of years. For humans, every jump was an act of controlled violence against the fundamental laws of physics. Earth's ships didn't use the elegant quantum manipulation drives of advanced civilizations. Instead, they relied on what human engineers cheerfully called brute force FTL, massive fusion reactors that temporarily destabilized local space-time through the application of obscene amounts of energy. The process was inefficient, dangerous, and produced enough exotic radiation to poison a small moon. It was also completely undetectable by conventional sensors. Captain Maria Santos watched the tactical display from the bridge of her destroyer, the UES Defiance, as the 12 ships of Earth's fleet emerged from their final jump at the edge of the Zephyrian system. What they found there was a vision of systematic destruction that would haunt human military doctrine for generations to come. The hegemony had approached the conquest of Zephyrian space with the methodical efficiency of an industrial process. Their fleet was arranged in precise formation around each inhabited world, with support vessels systematically stripping orbital installations while larger ships maintained planetary blockades. There was no passion in their deployment, no anger or hatred, just the cold calculation of species that had reduced genocide to a set of standard operating procedures. Jesus Christ, whispered Lieutenant Rodriguez from the sensor station. They're not even fighting anymore. They're just harvesting. Santos could see what he meant. The few remaining Zephyrian ships were trapped in decaying orbits around their homeworld, their engines dead and their weapon systems offline. They weren't being destroyed. They were being studied, their crews presumably interrogated for any useful information before being disposed of. Signal from Admiral Webb. Came the report from communications. Put him through. Webb's voice was steady, but Santos could hear the barely controlled fury underneath. All ships, final tactical briefing. Intelligence analysis confirms that the hegemony is following standard occupation protocols. They expect no interference and have deployed their forces for maximum efficiency rather than defense. The tactical display updated, showing the positions of over 400 enemy vessels spread across 12 planets. Primary objective is the rescue of as many Zephyrian civilians as possible. Secondary objective is the elimination of hegemony command structure. Tertiary objective is to send a message that this sector is no longer undefended. Santos found herself smiling grimly. Only humans would treat a 400-12 battle as an opportunity to accomplish multiple objectives. Rules of engagement are as follows, Webb continued. Hegemony forces are to be considered hostile combatants engaged in genocide. No quarter will be given to any vessel or installation participating in cultural elimination protocols. Civilian vessels attempting to withdraw will be allowed to do so. Any hegemony force that surrenders will be detained for war crimes trials. Admiral, came Captain Harrison's voice from the heavy cruiser Indomitable. What about the orbital bombardment platforms? Those are priority targets, Harrison. The hegemony has been using them to systematically destroy Zephyrian cultural sites. I want them gone. Santos pulled up the tactical analysis of the bombardment platforms. Each one was the size of a small space station, armed with enough firepower to crack continents. Under normal circumstances, approaching one would be suicide for anything smaller than a battleship. But humans didn't believe in normal circumstances. All ships execute Thunder Protocol in 3 minutes. Remember, we're not here to fight fair. We're here to win. Thunder Protocol was humanity's answer to the problem of being outnumbered and outgunned in space combat. Instead of engaging in traditional fleet actions with organized formations and coordinated maneuvers, Earth ships would scatter throughout the enemy fleet and attack like a pack of wolves. Unpredictable, vicious, and absolutely relentless. The protocol had been developed based on humanity's experience with asymmetric warfare throughout their history. When facing a superior enemy, you didn't try to match their strengths. Advise them to keep their heads down and be ready to evacuate civilians when we create openings. Ma'am, they're asking how many ships we have. Tell them we have enough. The attack began with the kind of violence that only humans could bring to bear. Instead of announcing their presence with demands or ultimatums, Earth's ships simply materialized throughout the hegemony. Human railguns have been designed to punch through Earth's most sophisticated defensive materials, and hegemony hull plating apparently hadn't been upgraded to deal with tungsten projectiles traveling at 30% of light speed. But it was Captain Shun in the Corvette Fury who provided the moment that would become legend in human military history. Finding herself surrounded by 6 hegemony frigates, she made a decision that violated every principle of space combat doctrine ever written. She rammed them. The Fury's mass was less than half that of any hegemony frigate, but it was traveling at nearly 1,000 kilometers per second when it struck the lead enemy vessel. The collision vaporized both ships instantly, but the debris cloud created by the impact traveling at relativistic velocities turned into an expanding sphere of destruction that crippled 2 more frigates and forced the remaining 3 to scatter. Throughout the battle zone, similar scenes of controlled chaos were playing out. Human ships appeared without warning, struck with devastating effectiveness, and vanished back into quantum space before enemy forces could respond. It wasn't elegant or sophisticated. It was the application of pure human aggression backed by engineering that prioritized lethality over efficiency. Admiral Webb, commanding from the flagship Sovereign, watched the tactical display with grim satisfaction. The hegemony fleet was reacting exactly as Earth's military analysts had predicted. They were trying to organize a coordinated response to what they perceived as a conventional fleet engagement. But there was nothing conventional about human warfare. "Admiral, we're receiving communications from multiple hegemony vessels," reported his communications officer. "They're demanding to know what species we are and requesting parley. Any ship that wants a parley can withdraw to the edge of the system and wait," Webb replied. "Any ship that doesn't withdraw in the next 10 minutes gets turned into cosmic debris." "Sir, they're asking about our authorization to interfere in hegemony operations." Webb looked at the display, showing Zephyrian cities burning under orbital bombardment. "Tell them our authorization comes from being the kind of species that doesn't stand by and watch genocide happen." The battle raged for 6 hours, and by the end of it, the hegemony's carefully organized occupation force had been reduced to scattered survivors fleeing toward the edge of the system. Of Earth's 12 ships, 3 had been destroyed, and 5 were heavily damaged, but they had accomplished something that the galactic community had declared impossible. They had stopped the hegemony. As rescue shuttles began evacuating Zephyrian civilians from the besieged worlds, Admiral Webb received a communication that would change everything. It came not from the hegemony fleet, but from a source much more significant. "This is Galactic Council Coordinator Thane Ka of the Celestial Concordium. Terran forces, you are hereby ordered to cease all military operations and submit to Council authority for violation of non-interference protocols." Webb looked around his bridge, noting the barely controlled anger on his crew's faces. They had just finished saving an entire civilization from extermination, and the galactic government's first response was to threaten them. "Coordinator Thane Ka, this is Admiral Webb. With all due respect, you can take your non-interference protocols and shove them up whatever orifice your species uses for waste disposal." The shocked silence that followed lasted nearly 30 seconds before Thane Ka's voice returned, now considerably less authoritative. "Admiral, you cannot simply ignore galactic law. There are procedures, protocols, established methods for handling these situations." "Really?" Webb's voice was deadly quiet. "And what procedure covers standing by while an entire species gets systematically exterminated? What protocol addresses ignoring distress calls because it's inconvenient? What established method do you use to sleep at night while children are murdered for the crime of existing?" The hegemony is a recognized galactic power with sovereign rights. The hegemony is a collection of genocidal maniacs, and if you can't see the difference, then you're part of the problem. Webb cut the transmission and turned to his communications officer. "Open a channel to all surviving Zephyrian facilities." "Channel open, sir." "Zephyrian Central Command, this is Admiral Webb. The immediate threat to your worlds has been neutralized. However, we expect the hegemony will return with reinforcements. We're prepared to offer technological assistance and military alliance to help you defend yourselves." The response came immediately. "Admiral, we accept your offer and formally request that Earth establish a permanent defense treaty with the Zephyrian Collective." "Treaty accepted. Welcome to the human sphere of influence." As Earth's ships began the work of establishing humanity's first interstellar alliance, nobody aboard had any illusions about what they had started. The Galactic Council would not forgive this challenge to their authority. The hegemony would return with overwhelming force. The entire balance of power in the galaxy was about to shift. But for the first time in galactic history, a species facing extinction had cried for help and received an answer. The stars were no longer silent, and Earth had announced its arrival on the galactic stage in the most human way possible, by picking a fight with the biggest bully in the neighborhood and winning. The galaxy was about to learn what happened when apex predators decided they'd had enough of watching others suffer. The emergency session of the Galactic Council convened 36 hours after the Battle of Zephyrian Prime. Though emergency was perhaps too gentle a word for what was happening in the ancient chambers of the Celestial Concordium. For the first time in over 2,000 years, a previously unknown species, had not only interfered in galactic politics, but had done so with such spectacular violence that the entire established order was now in question. Coordinator Thane Ka stood before the assembled representatives of 47 civilizations, his crystalline form reflecting the nervous energy that filled the chamber. As a member of the Quell hierarchy, his species had maintained galactic peace for millennia through careful diplomacy, strategic non-interference, and the understanding that some problems were simply too dangerous to solve. The humans had apparently missed that particular lesson. Esteemed colleagues, Thane Ka began, his voice resonating through the chamber's quantum translation matrix. We face an unprecedented situation. A species calling itself humanity has emerged from an uncharted sector and unilaterally intervened in a sovereign hegemony operation. The reaction was immediate and varied. The Veltar representative, a gaseous being contained within an environmental suit, spoke first. The hegemony's sovereignty has never been questioned. Their expansion rights were recognized by this very council 4 centuries ago. Their expansion rights, interjected Ambassador Kree Th of the Mindari Federation, did not include cultural elimination protocols. The hegemony was supposed to integrate subject species, not exterminate them. A rumble of disagreement came from the section occupied by the hegemony delegation. Grand Admiral Zorith, his scarred carapace bearing the marks of countless battles, rose to address the chamber. The Zephyrian resistance necessitated extreme measures. Cultural elimination was authorized under Emergency Protocol 7. By whom? The voice belonged to Counselor Ivath of the Ethereal Communion, one of the oldest species in the galaxy. I do not recall this council authorizing genocide. The hegemony does not require council authorization for internal security measures, Zorith replied coldly. Ambassador Kree Th's tendrils flared with agitation. Internal security? The Zephyrians were a free species with recognized territorial sovereignty. They were not hegemony citizens subject to your security measures. The debate might have continued for hours, as council sessions often did, but it was interrupted by the activation of the chamber's emergency communication system. The voice that emerged from the quantum speakers was rough, human, and completely unimpressed by the grandeur of its surroundings. This is Admiral Webb of the Terran Defense Coalition. I understand you've been discussing us. The chamber fell silent. In the entire history of the Galactic Council, no non-member species had ever directly accessed their secure communication network. The technological implications alone were staggering. Coordinator Thane Ka recovered first. Admiral Webb, you are addressing the sovereign governing body of galactic civilization without authorization or invitation. This is highly irregular. So, is committing genocide while the galactic government watches, Webb replied. But here we are. Grand Admiral Zorith stepped forward. Human, you have interfered in lawful hegemony operations and destroyed military vessels engaged in legitimate expansion activities. You will surrender yourself for trial or face the consequences. The sound that came through the speakers might have been laughter, though it was difficult for most species present to interpret human emotional expressions. Admiral, let me make sure I understand your position. You want me to surrender for the crime of stopping you from exterminating an entire civilization. You destroyed over 100 hegemony vessels and killed 30,000 personnel. And I'd do it again tomorrow if I found you engaged in the same activities. The bluntness of the statement sent ripples of shock through the assembled delegates. Galactic diplomacy had evolved over millennia to include elaborate protocols for expressing disagreement without direct confrontation. The human approach was disturbingly direct. Counselor Ivath spoke carefully. Admiral Webb, while your intentions may have been admirable, your actions have created a significant crisis. The hegemony is a major galactic power with substantial military resources. Your attack on their fleet could be interpreted as an act of war. It was an act of war, Webb replied matter-of-factly. War against genocide, war against the systematic destruction of sapient life, war against the kind of moral cowardice that lets atrocities happen because stopping them might be inconvenient. Ambassador Kree Th's translator worked frantically to process the concept of moral cowardice, a phrase that had no direct equivalent in most galactic languages. Admiral, you speak of morality as if it supersedes galactic law. In my species' experience, any law that permits genocide is not worth following. The chamber erupted in debate, with dozens of species attempting to explain the complex realities of galactic politics, the necessity of non-interference, and the dangers of allowing any single species to act as self-appointed guardians of galactic morality. The cacophony continued for several minutes before Webb's voice cut through it all. Enough. The single word, spoken quietly but with absolute authority, silenced the entire chamber. Even species that had never encountered humans found themselves responding to something primal in that tone. The voice of a predator that had decided talking time was over. Here's what's going to happen, Webb continued. Earth is formally establishing a mutual defense alliance with the Zephyrian Collective. Any attack on Zephyrian territory will be considered an act of war against humanity. Any attempt to resume cultural elimination protocols will be met with immediate and overwhelming force. Grand Admiral Zorth's translator buzzed with indignation. You cannot simply declare yourself the protector of an entire species. The Galactic Council regulates such arrangements through proper diplomatic channels. Then, maybe the Galactic Council should have done its job before things got to this point. Coordinator Thane Ka attempted to restore order. Admiral, surely we can find a diplomatic solution to this crisis. Perhaps a compromise that addresses both hegemony territorial claims and Zephyrian sovereignty concerns. What kind of compromise did you have in mind? The hegemony only genocides them on weekends. The translation of Webb's words caused several delegates to emit sounds of distress. The concept of negotiating partial genocide was so alien to most species that their translators struggled to process it. Admiral Webb, Counselor Ivath said slowly, you speak as if moral absolutes exist in a universe of infinite complexity. Surely you understand that galactic governance requires pragmatic considerations. I understand that my species evolved on a planet where the strong either protected the weak or were eventually replaced by something stronger. We've been the apex predators on our world for 200,000 years, not because we're the biggest or the fastest, but because we're the only species that reliably chooses violence when our core values are threatened. The statement sent a chill through the chamber. Most galactic species had evolved beyond predatory instincts millennia ago, developing sophisticated social structures that prioritize cooperation over competition. The idea of a species that had retained and weaponized their predatory nature was profoundly disturbing. Ambassador Kreth spoke hesitantly. Admiral, are you threatening this council? I'm explaining reality. The hegemony wanted to exterminate the Zephyrians because they thought nobody would stop them. They were wrong. Any other species that thinks genocide is an acceptable solution to their problems is also wrong, and they're going to find out just how wrong they are. Grand Admiral Zorth's carapace clicked with barely contained rage. Human, you command a fleet of 12 primitive vessels. The hegemony can field 10,000 warships, if necessary. Your threats are meaningless. You had 400 ships at Zephyrian Prime. How many made it home? The silence that followed was answer enough. Every delegate in the chamber had access to the battle reports, and the tactical analysis was sobering. A species that could destroy the majority of hegemony fleet with 12 ships was not following conventional rules of engagement. The hegemony will return with overwhelming force, Zorth continued, though with less certainty than before. You cannot protect every world we choose to claim. You're right. I can't protect every world. But I can make sure that any species that tries to commit genocide pays a price so high that they'll think twice about trying it again. Coordinator Thane Ka made one final attempt at diplomacy. Admiral, perhaps we could arrange a formal meeting between human and council representatives. Surely there are mutual interests that could form the basis for a peaceful resolution. There might be, Webb acknowledged. But that discussion happens after the hegemony formally abandons any claim to Zephyrian territory and agrees to compensate the survivors for the damage they've caused. Impossible. Zorth snarled. The hegemony does not negotiate with terrorists. Then you're going to have a very short conversation with my Marines when they visit your home system. The transmission ended abruptly, leaving the chamber in stunned silence. For the first time in galactic history, a species had not only defied the established order, but had done so with such complete confidence that many delegates found themselves questioning assumptions that had guided galactic civilization for millennia. Counselor Ivath was the first to speak. Colleagues, we appear to have encountered a species that operates from fundamentally different principles than our own. The question before us is whether we attempt to integrate them into existing structures or prepare for the possibility that those structures may need to change. Ambassador Krith studied the tactical analysis displayed on his workstation. The humans destroyed a major hegemony fleet with minimal losses. Their technology appears to be primitive, but their tactics are unprecedented. They fight like they expect to win regardless of the odds. They fight like predators, Thane-Ka said quietly. Not just apex predators, but apex predators that have retained their killer instincts while developing strategic intelligence. I'm not certain our current diplomatic frameworks are equipped to handle such a species. Grand Admiral Zorith rose from his position, his scarred carapace reflecting the chamber's crystalline lighting. The hegemony will not be intimidated by a species of primitive savages, regardless of their tactical innovations. If the Council will not act to maintain order, the hegemony will deal with this threat ourselves. Grand Admiral, Counselor Ivath said carefully, perhaps it would be wise to consider the implications of escalating this conflict. The humans have demonstrated capabilities that we do not fully understand. They have demonstrated the ability to achieve tactical surprise against an unprepared fleet. They will not have that advantage again. As the hegemony delegation departed, Thane-Ka found himself contemplating a disturbing possibility. For thousands of years, galactic civilization had operated on the assumption that conflicts could be resolved through negotiation, compromise, and the careful balance of competing interests. But what happened when one side refused to acknowledge the validity of that assumption? What happened when a species decided that some things were worth fighting for, regardless of the cost? The humans were about to provide the answer to that question, and Thane-Ka suspected that the galaxy would never be the same again. Meanwhile, in the depths of space between Earth and Zephyrian Prime, Admiral Webb stood on the bridge of the Sovereign and contemplated the tactical challenge ahead. The hegemony would return, probably with overwhelming force, and Earth's small fleet would be vastly outnumbered. But humans had been outnumbered before. They had faced extinction, slavery, and conquest by enemies that seemed impossibly superior. And somehow, they had always found a way to win. It was time to remind the galaxy why apex predators didn't negotiate with bullies. They eliminated them. The shipyards above Earth had never seen activity like this. In the 3 months since the Battle of Zephyrian Prime, humanity's industrial capacity had been pushed beyond all previous limits as the planet mobilized for what military analysts were calling the inevitable hegemony response. But this wasn't just about building more ships. It was about building them better, faster, and with technology that most humans had never dreamed possible. Dr. Elena Vasquez stood in the observation deck of Orbital Construction Platform 7. Watching as human engineers worked alongside their Zephyrian counterparts to install quantum shield generators on the newly constructed destroyer UES Retribution 2. The collaboration was remarkable not just for its technical achievements, but for what it represented, two species that had found common ground in their refusal to accept extinction. The integration is proceeding faster than we projected, reported Chief Engineer Martinez, his voice carrying the exhaustion of someone who had been working 18-hour shifts for months. The Zephyrians' defensive technology is compatible with our power systems, and their quantum communications arrays give us tactical coordination capabilities the hegemony won't expect. Vasquez nodded, studying the technical readouts on her tablet. The marriage of human aggression with Zephyrian innovation was producing weapons systems that defied conventional military doctrine. Human engineers had a talent for taking elegant alien technology and finding ways to make it more destructive, while Zephyrian scientists were fascinated by humanity's approach to problem-solving, which seemed to involve asking, how can we kill it, as the first step in any design process. What's the status on Project Fenris? She asked. Martinez's tired face broke into a grin. The prototype is ready for testing. The Zephyrians thought we were insane when we proposed it, but the theoretical projections are impressive. Project Fenris was humanity's answer to the fundamental problem of being outnumbered by enemy fleets. Instead of trying to build enough ships to match hegemony numbers, human strategists had decided to build ships that could do the job of entire squadrons. The result was a vessel that violated every principle of space combat design. massively overpowered, impossibly heavily armed, and absolutely guaranteed to either achieve total victory or catastrophic destruction. There was no middle ground, which was exactly how humans prefer to fight. Admiral Webb wants a demonstration for the Joint Command Staff in 6 hours, Vasquez said. Are we ready? Ma'am, we've been ready to show the galaxy what happens when humans stop playing nice. The demonstration took place in the Kuiper Belt, far enough from Earth to avoid collateral damage, but close enough for the assembled observers to witness humanity's latest contribution to galactic warfare. The test target was a decommissioned Hegemony heavy cruiser that had been captured during the Battle of Zephyrian Prime, a vessel that represented the pinnacle of enemy military technology. Admiral Webb stood on the observation deck of the command ship alongside General Hayes and their Zephyrian counterparts, watching as the UES Fenrir moved into position. The ship was unlike anything in Earth's previous fleet. Larger than a heavy cruiser, but smaller than a battleship, bristling with weapon systems that seemed to have been designed by someone who believed that overkill was a starting point rather than a goal. Fenrir is in position, reported Captain Shun, now commanding humanity's first true warship. All systems nominal. Requesting permission to engage. Permission granted, Webb replied. Show us what we've built. What followed was less a weapons test than a demonstration of systematic destruction. The Fenrir's primary armament consisted of human-designed railguns enhanced with Zephyrian quantum targeting systems, capable of firing projectiles that could punch through planetary crust. But the ship's real innovation was its secondary weapons array, hundreds of smaller guns that could track and engage multiple targets simultaneously. The captured Hegemony cruiser lasted exactly 17 seconds. Jesus, whispered General Hayes, staring at the expanding cloud of debris that had once been one of the galaxy's most advanced warships. How many of those can we build? Current production schedule calls for 12 within 6 months, Webb replied. But that's not going to be enough. Intelligence reports suggest the Hegemony is assembling a fleet of over 2,000 ships for their next attack. Zephyrian Fleet Commander Veldan spoke through his translator, his melodic voice carrying an undertone of grim satisfaction. Admiral Webb, our surviving population centers are ready for evacuation if necessary. We will not allow our people to become hostages to Hegemony aggression again. Nobody's evacuating, Webb said firmly. We're done running from bullies. The Hegemony wants a war? They're going to get one they'll never forget. The plan that emerged from the Joint Human-Zephyrian Command Council was typically human in its audacity and typically effective in its simplicity. Instead of waiting for the Hegemony to bring their massive fleet to Zephyrian space, Earth would take the fight to them. It was a strategy that required humanity to do something that no galactic civilization had attempted in over 1,000 years. They were going to attack a Hegemony home system. The target was Korthak Prime, the administrative center for Hegemony operations in their local stellar region. Intelligence provided by Zephyrian refugees indicated that the system contained not just major fleet facilities, but also the regional command structure responsible for authorizing cultural elimination protocols. More importantly, it was where the Hegemony was assembling their retaliatory fleet. The tactical situation is challenging, Admiral Webb explained to the assembled fleet commanders, both human and Zephyrian. Korthak Prime is defended by orbital fortresses, planetary shields, and a standing fleet of approximately 600 vessels. Our force consists of 24 human ships and 18 Zephyrian vessels that have been refitted with our weapon systems. Captain Santos, now commanding the newly constructed heavy cruiser Indomitable II, studied the tactical projections. Admiral, even with our technological advantages, those are still overwhelming odds. Are we sure this is better than a defensive strategy? Captain, the Hegemony is expecting us to defend. They're prepared for a siege, a battle of attrition, a fight where their superior numbers will eventually wear us down. They're not prepared for us to kick in their front door and start breaking their toys. Commander Veldan's translator buzzed with what humans had learned to recognize as Zephyrian amusement. Admiral, my people have a saying that translates roughly as the hunter becomes the hunted. I believe humans have a similar concept. We call it turnabout is fair play, General Hayes replied. But we usually say it right before we make someone regret starting a fight. The attack on Korthak Prime began 60 hours later, and from the moment human ships emerged from quantum space at the edge of the system, it was clear that the hegemony was facing something unprecedented. Instead of approaching in formation for a conventional fleet engagement, Earth's vessels scattered throughout the system like a pack of predators surrounding prey. Defender-class ships revealed their true purpose in the opening moments of the battle. Rather than engaging enemy vessels directly, they positioned themselves near major installations and began systematically destroying everything the hegemony had built. Orbital shipyards, communication arrays, defensive platforms, all of it reduced to expanding clouds of debris by weapons that treated heavily armored space stations like target practice. Captain Chun found herself facing 3 hegemony battleships simultaneously, a situation that would have been hopeless for any conventional vessel. But Defender had been designed by humans who understood that sometimes the best defense was overwhelming offense. Instead of attempting evasive maneuvers, she accelerated directly toward the enemy formation and opened fire with every weapon the ship carried. The result was spectacular. The lead battleship simply disintegrated under the concentrated fire, its destruction creating a debris field that forced the other 2 vessels to break formation. In the confusion that followed, Chen's ship disappeared into quantum space only to reappear behind the scattered enemies and repeat the process. Throughout the system, similar scenes were playing out as human tactics proved their effectiveness against conventional galactic warfare. Hegemony commanders had spent centuries perfecting strategies for fighting other civilized species, enemies that followed established protocols for fleet engagement, planetary assault, and territorial conquest. But humans weren't civilized in the way that other species understood the term. They were apex predators who had learned to cooperate, and when they went to war, they brought everything their evolutionary history had taught them about survival, violence, and the absolute necessity of winning at any cost. The battle raged for 12 hours, and when it ended, the Korthax system was a graveyard. Of the 600 hegemony vessels that had defended their regional stronghold, fewer than 50 escaped. Every major installation had been destroyed, and the planetary government had surrendered rather than face orbital bombardment. But the real victory wasn't tactical, it was psychological. For the first time in their expansion across the galaxy, the hegemony had been decisively defeated in their own territory by a force they had dismissed as primitive savages. Admiral Webb stood on the bridge of the Sovereign, surveying the wreckage of what had once been the hegemony's most important regional base. The tactical displays showed the systematic destruction of an empire's local infrastructure, but more importantly, they showed something else. They showed that the galaxy's self-appointed masters could bleed. Signal all ships, he ordered. Phase 1 is complete. Begin Phase 2. Phase 2 was even more ambitious than the attack on Korthak Prime. Instead of returning to defensive positions, the human Zephyrian fleet began moving through hegemony territory like a wildfire, striking at targets of opportunity and withdrawing before enemy reinforcements could respond. It was a strategy that Earth's military historians called total warfare, the systematic destruction of an enemy's capacity to wage war, regardless of conventional military targets. Supply convoys, administrative centers, communication networks, industrial facilities. All of it became fair game for human raiders who had decided that the hegemony's ability to threaten anyone, anywhere, needed to be permanently eliminated. The response from the galactic community was immediate and predictable. Emergency council sessions were called, diplomatic protests were filed, and formal demands for cessation of hostilities were transmitted through every available channel. Admiral Webb's response was characteristically direct. The hegemony started this war when they decided genocide was acceptable. It ends when they surrender unconditionally or when they no longer exist. Those are the only 2 options. As human and Zephyrian forces continued their systematic dismantling of hegemony infrastructure, a new reality began to settle over the galaxy. For thousands of years, galactic civilization had operated under the assumption that overwhelming military force was the ultimate arbiter of interstellar disputes. Humanity was about to prove that assumption wrong. Sometimes, the ultimate arbiter wasn't the biggest fleet or the most advanced technology. Sometimes it was the species that simply refused to lose. The final phase of what galactic historians would later call the Hegemony War began not with a massive fleet engagement, but but with a single transmission broadcast across every communication channel in known space. The voice that emerged from speakers on thousands of worlds belonged to Grand Admiral Zorith, but the tone was one that few species had ever heard from a hegemony leader. It was the sound of defeat. This is Grand Admiral Zorith of the Hegemony Supreme Command, broadcasting on all frequencies to the species known as humanity. We request immediate cessation of hostilities and formal negotiations for the termination of current conflicts. The transmission was intercepted by Admiral Webb aboard the Sovereign as his fleet prepared for what intelligence had identified as the final hegemony stronghold, their home system. 6 months of systematic warfare had reduced the galaxy's most feared empire to a handful of defended worlds and a leadership that was finally beginning to understand what they had provoked. Admiral came the voice of communications officer Chun. We're also receiving transmissions from the Galactic Council, 17 individual species governments, and approximately 43 different news organizations. Everyone wants to know if we're going to accept the hegemony's surrender. Webb studied the tactical display, showing the defenses around Hegemony Prime. Even weakened, the system represented a formidable challenge. Orbital fortresses that could crack moons, a fleet of over 300 surviving warships, and planetary shields capable of withstanding sustained bombardment. Under normal circumstances, assaulting such defenses would require overwhelming force and massive casualties. But humans have long since abandoned normal circumstances. Signal the fleet, Webb ordered. All ships prepare for final approach to Hegemony Prime. And patch me through to Grand Admiral Zorith. The communication link established within minutes, carrying with it the weight of 6 months of warfare that had reshaped galactic politics. When Zorith's image appeared on the main screen, Webb was struck by how much the alien leader had changed. The confident arrogance that had characterized their first meeting was gone, replaced by something that looked remarkably like fear. Admiral Webb, Zorith began, his translator working to convey what sounded like genuine desperation. The hegemony formally requests an armistice. We are prepared to discuss terms for the cessation of hostilities. I'm listening, Webb replied, though his tone suggested limited patience for negotiation. We propose a return to pre-war territorial boundaries, with recognition of Zephyrian independence and compensation for damages incurred during our expansion activities. Webb looked around his bridge, noting the barely controlled incredulity on his crew's faces. After 6 months of watching human forces systematically dismantle hegemony infrastructure across a dozen systems, their enemy was proposing to return to the status quo with minor territorial adjustments. Grand Admiral, let me make sure I understand your proposal. You want us to stop fighting, go home, and pretend that your attempted genocide of the Zephyrians was just a misunderstanding that can be resolved with some territorial paperwork. The hegemony is prepared to make significant concessions. The hegemony is prepared to surrender unconditionally, Webb interrupted. That's the only concession I'm interested in discussing. Zorith's carapace clicked with agitation. Admiral, you cannot seriously expect the hegemony to simply cease to exist. We are a civilization of billions, with a history spanning millennia. Surely some accommodation can be reached. You're absolutely right. The hegemony is a civilization of billions with a long history, which is exactly why you should have thought twice before deciding that genocide was an acceptable expansion strategy. The cultural elimination protocols were an extreme response to unusual resistance. The cultural elimination protocols were war crimes, Webb said flatly. And war criminals don't get to negotiate the terms of their punishment. The conversation continued for another hour, with Zorith making increasingly desperate offers for anything short of complete surrender. But Webb's position remained unchanged. The hegemony's choice was simple: unconditional surrender or continued warfare until they no longer existed as a political entity. It was Zephyrian Fleet Commander Veldan who finally provided the perspective that ended the debate. Speaking from his flagship, the newly constructed vessel Eternal Dawn, his translated voice carried the weight of a species that had stared extinction in the face. Grand Admiral Zorith, 6 months ago your forces were burning our cities and systematically destroying everything that made us who we are as a people. You called it necessity. You called it progress. You called it the natural order of galactic civilization. Veldan paused, And when he continued, his voice carried an edge that made even the human observers uncomfortable. Now you find yourself facing the same extinction you would have imposed on us. And you call for mercy, for negotiation, for understanding. Tell me, Grand Admiral, what mercy did you show our children? What negotiations did you offer our civilians? What understanding did you display for our desire to simply continue existing? The silence that followed lasted nearly a minute before Zorth responded. The hegemony accepts unconditional surrender. The formal surrender ceremony took place on a neutral space station orbiting the galactic capital, with representatives from every major civilization present to witness the end of an empire that had dominated local space for over 4 centuries. But while the ceremony was conducted according to ancient galactic protocols, the terms of surrender were distinctly human in their scope and finality. The hegemony would be dissolved as a political entity. Its territory would be placed under joint administration by a coalition of species that had suffered under their expansion. War crimes trials would be conducted for all personnel involved in cultural elimination protocols. And, perhaps most importantly, all hegemony military technology would be turned over to the coalition to ensure that such weapons could never again be used for genocide. Admiral Webb found himself standing before the assembled galactic leadership, many of whom were still struggling to understand how a species that had emerged from isolation less than a year ago had managed to single-handedly end one of the oldest conflicts in their region of space. Admiral, Coordinator Thane-Ka spoke carefully. The Council recognizes the effectiveness of your methods. However, we remain concerned about the precedent this sets for galactic governance. The principle of non-interference has maintained peace for millennia. Webb looked out at the assembled delegates, representing dozens of species with widely varying concepts of morality, justice, and responsibility. Coordinator, with all due respect, your non-interference principle didn't maintain peace. It maintained the status quo. There's a difference. But surely you understand the dangers of allowing any single species to act as galactic enforcers, pressed Ambassador Kreth. What happens when your definition of justice conflicts with established law? Then, established law needs to change, Webb replied simply. Any legal system that treats genocide as an acceptable solution to political problems isn't worth preserving. The debate that followed would continue for months in various forums, but the fundamental question had already been answered. Humanity had demonstrated that the galaxy's established order could be challenged, defeated, and replaced. The only remaining question was what would replace it. The answer came not from government officials or military leaders, but from the ordinary citizens of hundreds of worlds who had watched the hegemony war unfold. Across the galaxy, species that had lived in fear of aggressive neighbors began to ask a simple question. If the humans could do it, why couldn't they? The result was a wave of resistance movements, liberation wars, and popular uprisings that swept across galactic civilization like a wildfire. Species that had accepted subjugation for centuries suddenly discovered that their oppressors were not invincible. Empires that had ruled through fear found themselves facing enemies who were no longer afraid. Earth found itself inundated with requests for assistance, alliance, and intervention from species across the galaxy. The response was characteristically human in its directness. We can't fight everyone's wars for them, President Carter explained during a joint session of the Terran Congress. But we can provide technological assistance, tactical advice, and the promise that any species that commits genocide will answer to us personally. The new organization that emerged from these policies was officially called the Galactic Liberation Coalition, though most species simply referred to it as the humans and their friends. Its charter was simple: the protection of sapient life, the prevention of genocide, and the establishment of a galactic order based on a radical principle that might did not make right. Admiral Webb, now promoted to Supreme Commander of Coalition Forces, established his headquarters on a space station orbiting Zephyrian Prime, the same world where humanity had first announced its presence on the galactic stage by answering a desperate cry for help. "Sir," reported his aide, a young Zephyrian officer whose family had survived the cultural elimination protocols. "We're receiving a distress signal from the variant system. The technocracy is attempting to annex their territory, and the local government is requesting assistance." Webb looked at the tactical display, showing coalition forces scattered across dozens of systems, helping newly independent species build their own defense capabilities while deterring aggressive neighbors. It was a massive undertaking that would require decades to complete, but it was also necessary work. Signal the Third Fleet, he ordered. Tell them to prepare for immediate deployment to the variant system. Sir, that's the fourth intervention this week. Are we sure we have the resources to maintain this pace? Webb thought about the sound he had heard nearly a year ago, the sound of an entire civilization crying out for help while the galaxy turned a deaf ear. He thought about the children who had died while galactic leaders debated proper protocols and territorial sovereignty. He thought about the simple truth that had driven human evolution for 200,000 years. Sometimes the only choice was to fight. Officer, as long as there are species out there committing genocide, we'll find the resources to stop them. That's what humans do. As the coalition fleet prepared for another intervention, another rescue, another demonstration that the galaxy's new apex predators were not interested in ruling through fear, Webb received a personal communication from an unexpected source. Admiral, this is Dr. Vasquez. I thought you should know, we've intercepted communications from 17 different species that are actively abandoning aggressive expansion policies rather than risk confronting coalition forces. Apparently, the galaxy has decided that picking fights with humans is a poor survival strategy. Webb smiled, thinking about the distress call that had started it all. A desperate plea from a dying civilization that had been answered by a species that most of the galaxy had never heard of. Elena, I think we've accomplished something that galactic civilization couldn't achieve in thousands of years of careful diplomacy. What's that, sir? We've taught the universe that there are consequences for being a bully. As the coalition fleet jumped to quantum space, carrying with it the promise of intervention wherever sapient life was threatened, the galaxy settled into a new era of interstellar relations. It was an era defined not by the careful balance of competing empires or the elegant protocols of ancient diplomacy, but by a simple truth that a young species from Earth had written into the fundamental laws of cosmic civilization. When someone cries for help, apex predators answer the call. The stars were no longer silent, and they never would be again.